Picture this: London, a beacon of prosperity and ambition, a city that stands as a symbol of both the past and future of the United Kingdom. With an economy exceeding $500 billion, London alone would rank as the 26th largest economy in the world, comparable to the likes of Norway. For nearly 2 centuries, the city has thrived as a financial hub, offering high-value services that attracted the best minds from across the globe. But behind the glitzy skyline and iconic landmarks lies a deeper and grimmer reality, one that speaks volumes about the larger story of Britain. In recent years, the once glamorous facade of the UK has been fading, as evidenced by the stark rise in homelessness. In 2023, more than 1 in 50 Londoners found themselves without a place to call home, an alarming increase of 50% over the last decade. As wages have stagnated since the financial crisis of 2008, rising costs in every sector of life have made it increasingly difficult for people to stay afloat, let alone thrive. The cost of living has soared, and essential items like housing have become an almost unattainable luxury for many. It is no wonder that more and more young, skilled professionals are choosing to leave the country for greener pastures abroad, in places like New York, where the salaries are higher and the opportunities greater. Why would a country with such an image of wealth see an exodus of its most talented youth? The answer is clear. Living standards in the UK are declining, and at a rate faster than many can adjust to. If you exclude London from the equation, the rest of Britain begins to look economically bleak, performing even worse than Mississippi, which ranks at the bottom of US states in terms of per capita economic performance. The gap between the UK and its northwestern European peers has been growing steadily since 2007. Back then, the average UK household was about 8% worse off than households in countries like Germany or Denmark. Today, that difference has widened to a staggering 20%, with further declines predicted. Imagine a future where the average Slovenian or Polish family enjoys a better quality of life than the average British household. That future, by some estimates, could be just around the corner, perhaps by the end of the decade. It isn't just statistics. These numbers reflect a real and growing disparity that is felt by the most vulnerable members of society. While the UK's wealthiest 5% still enjoy a high standard of living, those at the bottom find themselves falling behind not only their European counterparts, but also those in nations traditionally seen as less developed. As opportunities dwindle at home, many Britons are seeking better opportunities elsewhere. The National Health Service, NHS, long considered one of the cornerstones of British welfare, is witnessing a mass departure of doctors, nurses, and healthcare workers. Underpaid, overworked, and feeling unappreciated, these professionals have become part of a broader trend, a brain drain that sees the UK losing some of its brightest and best to other countries. Ironically, even as British talent leaves, immigration into the UK continues to rise. Yet, the skills gap is widening, as those coming in are often less skilled than those leaving. This imbalance does not bode well for the economy, as lower skilled workers cannot generate the same economic value, leading to decreased productivity and an erosion in the quality of public services. To understand where Britain stands today, it's helpful to look back to the 1990s, a time when things seemed to be going well. This was the era of Cool Britannia, when the world looked to Britain not just for its economy, but also for its culture. Oasis and the Spice Girls were ruling the airwaves. The Cold War was over, and a mood of optimism was sweeping through the country. From 1992 onwards, the UK experienced its longest stretch of economic growth since World War II. The long expansion, driven by the flourishing financial sector, saw property lending soar and consumer spending boom. But even during this boom, cracks were beginning to show. The shift towards a service-based economy, while creating wealth in the short term, also dismantled industries that had provided broad-based employment, particularly in mining and heavy industry. These industries were the lifeline for poorer regions, far from the affluence of London. The seeds of today's inequality were sown in those years, as areas that relied on manufacturing and industry were left behind. No discussion of Britain's current woes would be complete without delving into the housing crisis, a critical factor driving the exodus of young people. Home ownership, once an achievable goal for many, has become a distant dream for most young Britons. The Right to Buy scheme introduced in the late 1970s, which allowed council tenants to buy their homes at discounted rates, dramatically reduced the supply of public housing. This might have seemed progressive at the time, enabling many to step onto the property ladder, but it also drastically cut down on social housing stock. Without sufficient replacements, and as the population continued to grow, the imbalance between housing supply and demand became became untenable. Fast forward to today and we see the devastating consequences. House prices have risen far beyond the reach of the average wage earner. Social housing is in short supply, and the private rental sector, burdened with overwhelming demand, has become increasingly unaffordable. The UK's restrictive planning laws and prioritization of economic growth over housing construction have only made things worse. As a result, more people are being pushed into temporary accommodation and homelessness. These aren't just numbers. These are stories of families being moved from place to place, children missing school, and adults losing jobs, all contributing to the country's declining social mobility. The 2008 financial crisis exposed the UK economy's weaknesses. Its over-reliance on financial services was laid bare, and the failure to invest in other critical sectors led to a significant setback. Today, public services are in disarray, infrastructure is aging, and the NHS is struggling like never before. The National Health Service, which has long been a source of national pride, now finds itself in a precarious position. Rising costs due to an aging population, technological advancements, and inflation have overwhelmed the system. Even with increased funding and staffing levels, there is barely enough to maintain day-to-day operations, let alone invest in the long-term improvements that are desperately needed. Brexit has only added to these problems, making an already challenging situation even worse. By leaving the European Union, the UK effectively reduced its trade with its largest partner, complicating logistics and increasing costs for businesses. Yet, the referendum to leave the EU was, in many ways, a cry for change from those who felt left behind by globalization. Unfortunately, the reality has not matched the hopes of those who supported Brexit, as economic hardships have only deepened since. The 1990s were a time of privatization, with hopes that handing over services to the private sector would lead to better infrastructure investment and economic growth. While some sectors benefited, many of the country's essential services suffered from underinvestment, as profit motives often took precedence over long-term development. The ill-fated High-Speed Rail 2 (HS2) project is a fitting example of the UK's inability to adequately plan and execute infrastructure projects. Costs skyrocketed, deadlines were missed, and eventually the project was abandoned. The failure of HS2 is a symbol of Britain's broader struggle to adapt and evolve. The story of why so many people are choosing to leave the UK is not just a story of economic misfortune. It is a story of lost potential and a failure to adapt. Rising inequality, an underfunded healthcare system, unaffordable housing, and dwindling productivity have all contributed to a nation in decline. The vibrant optimism of the 1990s is long gone, replaced by an increasingly grim outlook. The younger generations, in particular, have found themselves trapped in an economic environment that does not reward their hard work or ambition. With stagnant wages, unaffordable housing, and a healthcare system in crisis, many are choosing to look elsewhere for a better quality of life. If things are to improve, the UK must invest in its people and its future. It must address the deep-seated inequalities that have driven a wedge between the haves and have-nots. It must invest in housing, in healthcare, and in opportunities for its youth. Only then can the UK hope to reverse the trends of the last decade and begin to rebuild a nation that people want to live in, not just survive in.